Good afternoon. My name is Timothy Hampton. I'm the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome to today's Berkeley Book Chat. The Berkeley Book Chats feature a Berkeley faculty member in conversation about a recent publication. Today we feature Professor Mairi McLaughlin of the Department of French talking about her new book, La Presse française, historique. She'll be in conversation with Professor David Bates of the Rhetoric Department. Before I turn the floor over to Mairi and David, I'm happy to announce that next week we'll be hosting another book chat. This one will feature Professor Karen Feldman of the German department talking about her newest book, Arts of Connection. So please join us for that event at the same time in the same place next week. For today, I want to remind you that our guests will speak for about 45 minutes, after which we'll open the floor for questions. So feel free to contribute your comments and questions by using your chat function. Now it's my great pleasure to turn the proceedings over to Mairi and David. Welcome both of you to the Townsend Center.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. And welcome Mairi as well. I feel like I'm the host now. So we're here to talk about Mairi's new book, which is here. The La Presse française historique, which is the history of both the genre and history of language. So welcome, Mairi. And I have to say, when I first met you, this was quite a few years ago now when I was directing the Berkeley Center for New Media. You were doing quite different work. This is about the 17th and 18th century in France. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you started your own work on the French language in that context when I invited you to speak about new techniques of analyzing large databases, new ways of analyzing text, which was your PhD and first book.
Yeah, okay, so thank you, David, and thank you for doing this conversation today. Yeah, I think we met in around 2011 or 2012, which is just the point at which my first book had come out. So my first book really kind of stems from an experience as an undergraduate where I was doing a degree in modern languages, and I was taking more courses in linguistics rather than in literature. And I came across this hypothesis, which has been around since the early 20th century, which is that as journalists translate news from one language into another, they might borrow from that original language, not just words, like French might have borrowed things like cool or iPhone, but they would also borrow aspects of grammar. So in the case of English into French, people thought, for example, that you would find more adjectives before nouns in French than you normally do because that's where the adjective goes in English. Or that you'd find more examples of passive constructions in French because the passive is simply more frequent in English. So I had this question, and I realized kind of early on, like, in academia, as in life, if you want to know an answer to a question, you probably have to go and find it out yourself. So that's what led to this PhD dissertation in a first book, which was on the process and product of news translation in the contemporary press. So I worked in news agencies in France and in Italy. I carried out ethnographic fieldwork. I observed the process of translation. I interviewed the journalists, and I gathered a corpus of translated news texts that had been translated from English into French and Italian to then kind of take home with me and analyze to try to identify moments at which the grammar, the syntactic makeup of the text might have been influenced by English. And in doing that work, I kept coming across this hurdle, which was that I had all of this data for the contemporary press, but I didn't really have any knowledge of what came before. So linguists had worked on the press in the 20th century, but there hadn't been any linguistic study of the press before the 20th century. So I'd done that project and worked on, I think I remember the name of the talk that I gave was something cheesy, like good things come in small packets. So this was sort of at the start of the digital humanities, but actually corpus linguistics had existed for quite a long time. So I think I probably was working at the interface of those two very, very related fields. And I was arguing that there's a real value, even if you want to carry out quantitative work and do what we now call kind of distant reading, there's a real value to also knowing the texts inside out. And that's something that, I did in the first project by sitting in the newsroom, watching the individuals translate these texts and copying every text. I know my way around, the news from November 2005 very well. And I still remember exactly what happened because I sort of lived the composition of that corpus. And that's something I think which really helped me understand what questions to ask and how to ask the questions of the corpus of text and how to interpret the answers. And that's something that I kind of took over then into this second project. This is, really the kind of second big project of my career. And it's a sort of similar idea that, in fact, the corpus is not dissimilar in size, and it's still what I would think of as a kind of medium-sized corpus rather than a multi-million word corpus. It's really it's big enough to do some quantitative work to get some statistics and some kind of concrete answers, but it's small enough that you know what's going on in the texts.
So this is an interesting question then, is why choose the period that you did? I mean, you say there hasn't been much work before the 20th century, and clearly you were doing a lot of analysis of digital texts and so on in that period, the contemporary period. So what made you go back to this particular moment in time, especially in France?
Yeah, I mean, so this, I didn't know, right? When I set out to do a project on the historical French press, I had no idea what time period I was going to work on. As a historian of the language, it's quite different from being, in literary studies or cultural studies or in history, where you often specialize in a period. Historians of individual languages can kind of dot around the history of the language and can end up working on really different periods. So yeah, my first book was post-internet, and then this book is 17th and 18th century. So how I landed on this period was by trying to find, and this now in hindsight feels a little naive, but I wanted to find the beginning. Right? When does journalism start? When do you get the first newspapers and periodicals? And so thankfully, there's a huge field of scholarship in history on the history of the press, and especially the history of the French press. So reading through that kind of bulk of scholarship carried out by historians led me to this period. So the project starts in 1631, and I chose that date because it's the year, it's the year in which the first kind of successful long-term periodical publication is founded in French. And that's called the Gazette, or Gazette de France. In English, it's often known as the Paris Gazette, and that's how it was known at the time in the English press, for example. But the fact that this is the first long-term successful periodical doesn't actually mean that it's the first moment of journalism. News circulated before then. The only thing that changes at the start of the 17th century is that news becomes periodical. And thinking about that sort of in relation to the work that I've done on the contemporary period is actually sort of it's been quite productive, because what you have before the 17th century is news published in response to events. So either printed news sheets that might be kind of sold at the market, or handwritten news sheets as well. And they always come out because something has happened. And then what you get from the 17th century onwards is periodical publications. So they are published, with the Gazette de France, it's every Friday, for example. And then by the end of the 18th century, in French, you have daily newspapers. And then today, thinking about it, actually, our news, in some ways, with the kind of 24-hour news channels, with online news, like these live streams that you get, our news has kind of gone beyond periodical news as well, right? We still obviously have many periodicals, but things change in response to events a little bit like they did before the advent of the periodical press. So I think of that boundary between the pre-periodical and the periodical press as somehow a little bit less clear than beforehand. So that's the start of the period. And then, reading all of the work by historians, I was trying to just get a general impression of how the press evolved, up until the moment when linguists have started looking at it, which is really after the Second World War. That's when linguists have worked on the French press. And there seemed to be this, very clearly demarcated period, which is from the early 17th century until the French Revolution of 1789. So that seems like a very sensible kind of end point, although within that period, it has its own contours as well. And actually some of the results from this linguistic work really speak to those contours as well. So I try to have a period, but not think about it as a kind of simple or kind of singular period, but a period with its own dynamics and movement.
Well, as someone that well, I still do some work in the period of the 18th century, but I started my career there, and you're absolutely right that the 18th century, by then everyone agrees that the press is a hugely important new sort of discursive cultural medium of some kind. And I think that this periodical structure that you mentioned, it was lent itself to people being able to see what was in the news at a particular time and to discuss it. And unlike today, where you don't really discuss the news, you sort of react to news feeds. But in those days, you had the coffee houses with the newspapers, and whether we read someone like Habermas or what have you, it seems like this was an extremely important period for creating something like the dynamics that led to the French Revolution. But as you said, you're not a historian of the press in that sense, of someone who's trying to track the history of a certain kind of institution. You're the historian of the French language. So this is interesting to me to kind of understand what it means to be a historian of a language. You're both a linguist, but you mentioned in the book, especially in the first half, how you also are trying to incorporate what's called sociolinguistics, but also doing something that's not sociolinguistics. So maybe we could at least clarify that for a second, because it's a really interesting methodological problem and gets at what you're trying to argue in the book. So as a historian of the language, how are you both a linguist, a sociolinguist, but also forging a kind of new path with this attempt to analyze the specifics of the French press in early modern, or at least 17th to 18th century?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the one thing I would say with that is you want to sort of not end up being a jack of all trades and master of none, right? So if I'm kind of ring fencing what I'm kind of not a historian, but I'm trying to use as much of work that's been done in history to tell me how to use the language of the press, how to interpret it. Again, that thing about what questions to ask, how to ask them, and how to interpret the results. I think the best way to think about that is to place this work in a larger context of the work that's been done on the history of French. So the history of French has a really long history itself. People were interested in the history of the language in the periodical press. So it isn't, there's nothing kind of brand new about the history of French, but what has changed quite recently is that linguists have started incorporating a wider range of texts into the work that's been done on the history of French. So until the kind of late 20th century, almost everything that we knew about the history of French was based on literary texts. So we almost had a kind of history of literary French, and those two things were synonymous. So there's been a move away from literary texts where we're trying to add other text types. And in fact, people are adding types of text that are very different from what I have here. I still have very kind of homogeneous, standard, high register written texts. So I haven't gone as far as other people have in moving away from the literary language. So I could have done this project where I just, gathered a load of these historical newspapers and periodicals and counted things, right? A lot of the work in this book is counting, when you have, I suppose I'm primarily on the linguistic side interested in moments of variation and change. So variation when a new form enters the language, then the moment when the two forms might be used in competition with each other, and then at a certain point that the old form will fall out. And over the period that I'm looking at, several changes happen in this way. So you see the form being introduced, you see both forms in use, and then you see the old form falling out of use. So I could have kind of counted those things and identified a set of moments when change took place. And I think that would have been fine. But I think I would have missed part of the picture if I had just used the text as a source of kind of numerical data, essentially. So the book is in two halves, and these two halves really reflect the kind of principle here, which I've said before, which I think you need to understand the texts that you're looking at, the genre that you're looking at, and its relationship to the sociocultural moment. It's a product of that moment. It's the media, so it's also influencing that moment, which makes the media really interesting to look at and kind of difficult to look at. So it's only, I think, through an understanding of the text in context that I'm able to really understand the impact that they might have had, or whether they are indeed reflecting or constructing change. So for me, all of those linguistic questions are not really questions that are about a linguistic form or the structure of the language. It's embedded in the use of speakers. Language is not just a structure in my take on it. So that's why I suppose some of this work you might think of as it's kind of linguistics embedded in cultural history, social history at times. I'm reading things about military history, so it's kind of embedded in that very large context to try and understand the significance of the data that the texts provide.
Could I just, this is super interesting to me, in particular, when you mentioned the intersections of like military communication, which these dispatches about wars taking place in the 18th century, but also other kinds of news that might seem more ephemeral and so on. But maybe the question that you could or answer for me a little bit here is to say, what specifically is important about the press? You're not choosing it arbitrarily as just a project, that there's something interesting about the language of the press. And I would say what we might hypothesize, not knowing very much, is to say, well, clearly the press was important for creating a kind of more national language or homogenization of the language. And we'd probably be thinking more of mass media in the 19th century and 20th century for that. So what is particularly interesting for you about the kinds of texts that you were working with in terms of thinking about the evolution of the French language? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think a kind of banal answer would be that all of the texts that are out there, as linguists, it's our duty to try and get the data out of them. And then by putting everything together and triangulating, we might be able to understand what was actually happening in language at that kind of slightly more abstract level of language as a language as an abstract system, or more kind of concretely in spoken language, that thing that we are frustratingly never going to be able to access for those past states of the language. So I think the sort of trivial answer to the question is, well, because they're there, we should look at them. And that is to say that I don't think we should exclude any type of text from the work on the history of the language. And I think the most productive work that's being done right now is through triangulation. It's through comparing at least 3 different genres or 3 different registers or styles. When you start doing that, you start to actually fill in some of the pictures and get a much more multidimensional image of the history of the language. And indeed, the same is true for work on contemporary usage today. You couldn't imagine a linguistic study which sort of ignored everything in every genre apart from a single genre. So this is just something that's sort of happening more obviously now for the past as well. So that's the first answer to that question. The second question is, well, why would the media therefore be a priority, right? Why did I choose that before maybe other types of texts that I could have gone to look at? And I think there it comes back to both the importance of the media in that period, but I suppose even before the mass media of the 19th century, even this pre-revolutionary press, even in the 16th century where you have news sheets, or maybe gossip in the Middle Ages. All of these things are maybe you might link them as information, as various types of information, which was distinct then. We'll try and keep it distinct from literature, although that's a kind of another Pandora's box really for this period. And I think what's why the media is so important is again this role that it plays at once reflecting what's happening in the larger society, or to use a kind of linguistic term, in the community of speakers, but it also plays a role in constructing that. So this kind of tension between the media as reflecting change and the media as creating change, I think for me is one of the most interesting things about the media. And it's interestingly for linguists, so historians of French definitely recognize the role that the media played in this period in influencing the evolution of the language. So they say, for example, that it contributed to the spread of French. At this period, France wasn't made up of a whole host of native speakers of French. There were native speakers of dialects. There were native speakers of other languages. So in this period, we're still, it's a very much a multilingual country. And so, but when the periodical press is introduced, you've got a new way in which the French language is being distributed. And it's not just in Paris. These newspapers might have been published there, or the ones that I was looking at were published there, but they were reprinted around the country. So these texts were able to reach a wider and a broader audience, I think, than literary texts of the period. It's not the most commonly read type of text, but it's up there and it's before literature. So they're reaching a very broad audience. And in fact, in this period, so at the start of the period, the French language periodicals are published in France, but from the 1670s onwards, they get published outside France as well. So French is expanding within France, and then French is also expanding outside France. And so the historians of French have also linked the development of the press to French turning into a kind of, they called it at the time, the universal language. We might think of it as something more like a lingua franca used in, diplomacy, for example, spoken obviously by kind of social elite around Europe. And you can see that with, if you look now at the archives for where you can access some of these periodicals, like the Gazette d'Amsterdam, there's a full run of the Gazette d'Amsterdam. So it's a French language newspaper published in Amsterdam, and there's a full run of it in Sweden. So the French language press contributes to this diffusion of French outside France. So linguists have recognized those things, but in the second half of the 20th century, I'd say until fairly recently, sociolinguists were a bit less interested in the media. They were primarily interested in variation and change that took place through face-to-face interaction, and really to the exclusion of all studies of the media. The media was linked to things like borrowings from other languages, or the coining and spreading of new words. But sociolinguists, for a long time thought that the sort of the meat, the real kind of, what really matters essentially in a language is not affected by the media. And that's begun to change. That's been changing really since the 2010s. There's much wider acknowledgement that the media is doing much more than just giving us the odd new word to use. And so I've kind of always been persuaded of that, but it's really nice to see now that's being done. I think the most exciting work that I know on the contemporary period that shows that is a work done by a group of scholars in Glasgow who work on the media, and they have this great study of speakers in Glasgow who speak standard Scottish English, but they use a vowel that comes from the East End of London. And the reason that it's being used, the hypothesis is to do with the soap opera EastEnders, which is very famous British soap opera. So you might think that what you do is you go and you look at how many hours each person spends watching that, and you expect to see that the more someone watches it, the more they use that vowel. But that actually isn't what happens. What they've shown is that the more someone engages with the soap opera, the more they will use that vowel. So this kind of active process of engagement identification is where the media then can influence language. For the 17th and 18th century, I think we have really high levels of engagement within that proportion of the population that is literate, right? So people are incredibly thirsty for this news. Looking at these historical newspapers, they might read as kind of very dry dispatches today, but if this was the only news that you have seen from Constantinople in 3 months, this is front page news. This is extremely exciting. And there are examples of people for sure engaging with the news, discussing the news, as you said, in cafes, in these kind of news bureau where people could go. You could go to a kind of stand to read newspapers. People would gather around there. There are images of people gathered in parks with a newspaper. And there are also examples where we know of people sending each other clippings from the press in their own correspondence. So I think the level of engagement was very high with the press in this period. So everything aligns for the press to play a role. What hasn't aligned so far is linguists haven't actually studied whether it did. These are just assumptions. And so this is the first kind of real systematic attempt to determine whether it did play the role that we thought it played.
That's a perfect segue into a question that I think we need to ask, which is what you actually did in this work when you say systematic analysis and the first sort of comprehensive or attempt at a more broad study of language. You've hinted, and I think we talked at the very beginning about the digital humanities as being one of your methods, but you hedged a little bit there in that you don't want to maybe fully identify with the image we might have of a digital humanist who simply counts masses and masses and masses of textual information. And this question of engagement is a perfect example. You don't really count engagement. You need to have some knowledge about how these texts circulated and were employed. So the book, though, is very much governed by certain kinds of statistical and other analyses. And you did, well, what did you do? I imagined at first it was you had a database of digitized periodicals and you ran, I don't know, algorithms that would reveal something. And after talking to you, I realized that was absolutely not the case, but you're very modest in some ways, talking about your medium-sized corpus, but maybe you can explain how difficult it actually was to create this database that allowed you to do the kind of work that you were doing here. And we can talk a little bit about why. I was just going to say that medium sometimes sounds like could be betwixt in between. It's not small and it's not large, it's just kind of in between. But you could also have the Goldilocks kind of idea, which is the perfect size. It's not too large and it's not too small. So maybe just run through your method here in creating what you actually studied. Was there a digitized database of periodicals?
If only.
No.
If there had been a digitized database of periodicals, this book would have come out 5 years ago. We would be talking about a totally different project by now. So no, when I kind of started this project, this was in around 2012, I didn't find any examples of any digitized periodicals for French at that time. There were many examples of images of the periodicals that you could access online, but there was no database where you could just query something. There was nothing that was searchable. Since then, some things have begun to appear. So I noticed recently a few years of the Gazette d'Amsterdam, I think it is now appears, might be the Gazette de France actually, now appears for the late 17th century. You can find 3 years online. So I think these things are appearing now. I think it's going to change really quickly. But no, when I started this out, all I had were images, which were either images taken by libraries and shared on their through their catalog. There was a really good resource which kind of brought everything together for the 18th century press, where you can see for every title, it would tell you if there were images of each edition available. So that was invaluable in just finding out what I could access before I could get into libraries to see things. But certain of these periodicals, I couldn't even see an image before going to the library. So I was really just looking at the originals, bound versions of the periodicals that were created at the time. So yeah, you can't run a plain text search on a bound version of a periodical. So I did explore the potential for using software, OCR software, to digitize things. So, where you scan and you ask the tool will turn it into text. but the percentage success rate was very low for these texts because they're printed text from the 17th century to begin with, the 18th century, and OCR was developed, to do things like scan modern novels. So that was basically a non-starter. It would have taken longer to correct the errors than it would to type everything out myself. So the first kind of the consequence of this absence, right? It wouldn't have been the same working on the English press. This work has already been done for the English press. So there are 3 or 4 big corpora of historical newspapers for English. So if anyone wants to do this work on English, the data is there for you. You can get to work straight away. But the early stages of this project was constructing the corpus. And so it was clear from the start that I wasn't going to be able to look at every newspaper. There's a great dictionnaire des journaux, a dictionary of ancien régime periodicals, and it has over 1,200 entries in it. So we're talking about 1,200 different periodicals from the period. And then if you take like the Gazette de France, this one, the first kind of major long-term periodical, the historian Stéphane Hafmeyer has worked on this, and he worked on just 17 years of the Gazette de France, and he found there that there are over 20,000 dispatches published in 17 years. That's over 22,000 pages of text, and the dispatches come from almost 800 different locations in Europe. So that's just 17 years of one periodical. So there's no way I was going to be able to do anything comprehensive. And so how I kind of viewed this as this is the project where I show the value of working on historical newspapers and periodicals in order at some future date to persuade someone to help finance the transcription or the production of digital editions where you could then work on every single edition of a range of periodicals. So it was a kind of proof of concept project. What I decided to do, I used the work that historians have done to identify the newspapers and periodicals that I wanted to work on. And so I simply chose those which were generalist publications. So I didn't want anything kind of specialist. I wanted the publications that reached the largest number of people, that covered the broadest range of topics. So they're all generalist publications. I looked only at publications founded during this period that I was interested in, from 1631 to 1789. But I also wanted them all still to be in existence in 1789. And this is because I wanted to look both at how the genre evolved over time and how changes kind of took place over time. But I also wanted to be able to take a snapshot of one year and see in that year what's happening across the different genres. So I have these two kind of axes, the kind of horizontal and the vertical axis for the inquiry, and that was sort of necessary to think about, on the one hand, like linguistic change, on the other hand, variation between different types of newspaper and periodical. So I had identified a set of periodicals. I identified 5, which were really, the major, or some of the most kind of best known major periodicals from that period. But even then, working on all 5, every edition of all 5, for this 150-year period would have been impossible. I would still be sitting in, I don't know, 1633 at this point or something. So I constructed a corpus where I sample the product every 25 years. So that's kind of a rough notion of a generation. Let me choose that. And then each year I look at every edition published within 1 month. So January 1632, and then I moved to 1657, looking at March, and so on. So in the course of the 7 years that I sample, right up until 1782, I cover the whole of a year, but by doing a month every 25 years. And at that point, I'd chosen this, I had the sample, I got all of the images, and there's a certain amount of work that I can do through just manual reading, traditional reading. There's certain types of linguistic construction that are easier to pick out that way. There are certain types of things I was interested in which just don't lend themselves to digitization, like the structure of the news text. It's, reading the news text was helping me answer that question before any other kind of coding would have done. So I could get started on that, but really the project wouldn't have been possible without being able to do some slightly higher level quantitative work, running some kind of basic plain text searches and doing some statistical tests. And so I set about transcribing and a proportion of the corpus. In the end, the part that's transcribed is about 400,000 words. It's fully transcribed. That's about 80% of the corpus as a whole. I did most of it myself, but I did have a research assistant, a former graduate student at UC Berkeley, who did a wonderful job with some of the transcription for the final year for 1782. So that process was, I mean, I'm not sure I would recommend that. I was on sabbatical when I started this work, and I could spend the daytime doing the kind of manual work and starting to write up bits of the project. And then I spent every night transcribing. And that wasn't ideal, but it paid off because it let me do this work. And in fact, once I had started this project, I then got asked to work to do a critical edition of another periodical, and the publisher who is going to publish this critical edition. In fact, it will also be a digital edition of the periodical. They paid for the whole thing to be transcribed. So in some ways, the plan worked, right? I got asked to do that based on the fact that I was already doing this project.
But it seems like what's really important here is that, you know, you weren't just transcribing it because you couldn't afford. I remember an anecdote about the Artful database, which is the I forget what the acronym is, but it's the Treasury of the French language that is housed at the University of Chicago, which is has been going for some time now. I learned that the Encyclopédie, which is this massive, huge publication of the 18th century, was transcribed by hand as well, but it was offshore laborers who had no knowledge of French, and definitely not knowledge of French orthography usually as well. So like you say, the error rate was really high. But for you transcribing, it meant that you were able to do something akin to close reading of a large number of texts, and at the same time prepare the way for these quantitative studies. So I think this is what you mean by a medium-sized text is really not a compromise, but the opposite. It's allowing you to gain a fairly unusual perspective on a large number of texts by actually knowing them intimately, and at the same time testing some of your hypotheses with more quantitative tools. So my question might be more specific, which is to say, could you give an example of where that, you know, where that knowledge, the intimate immersion into the whole corpus benefited the kind of analysis that you were able to offer? Because it seems like you do resist a kind of purely quantitative approach to the history of language. So do you have a particular example that might be helpful there?
Yeah. I mean, I think the way that I think about that work on the transcription is, as you say, it isn't just that it created something that I could then use. The process itself was really informative. I do feel like I know the text inside out because of that process. And in some ways, that transcription work is akin to the ethnographic work that I did in the news agencies, where you're just there every day, you're kind of immersed in it. And that, you know, I don't know how much closer we can get to texts from the past than just sitting with them and reading them inside out. And I think that it paid off in lots of different ways. I mean, it definitely kind of gave me ideas about things to look at, you know, just things I've never have known what to look at. I've never have known, you know, the book has a set of case studies. It wouldn't have been clear to me what those should be without the knowledge of the text. Some of the things in the case studies you can't see without the quantitative work, but other aspects were just a result of the reading. So I think the whole project hinges on that process. For specific examples, I can think of two. So one is an example actually where it wasn't, it was an example where I had transcribed one for 1782. I had transcribed a month of editions from one newspaper, and my research assistant transcribed another. In fact, that highlighted the benefit of only one person doing it, because I hadn't realized that some of the same stories were appearing in our two different newspapers. And so when I kind of sat and read through those transcriptions, the fact that I hadn't done it made me realize I kind of would have missed that. And it was really revealing to find a news story which was clearly based on the same source, but it was presented in two different ways in two different newspapers. And the two ways that it was presented spoke to really kind of different, the different styles of those two newspapers. So that's one example. And then another example, I was trying, when I kind of think at the outset of this project, I thought of this as a kind of history of a language, a history of journalistic French was what I was trying to write. And I realized that wasn't right. And I kind of corrected that. But one thing I wanted to do was sort of to try to date these texts. So if you think of the press today, we often talk about journalism as being relatively innovative, and certainly compared to literary texts, right? That you blame journalists for innovations, for new forms, for new turns of phrase. Like this is a kind of general linguistic attitude that we see in the public. And this, I wanted to know if, is the same true in the past? So I wanted to know whether these journalistic texts are somehow more advanced, or if they represent a more advanced stage of the language than the literary texts that had been so well studied. So I took a couple of forms, maybe more than a couple. I took some forms which were very well studied for literary French, and we knew that they had fallen out of use in the early 17th or mid 17th century. And I wanted to see whether these forms also fell out of use at the same moment in the corpus of journalistic texts. And it turns out that, almost all of them are never used in this corpus. And so this gave me one kind of really kind of a thread, I guess, of a finding that goes across the book, which is that that as changes take place, they often take place, the kind of big moment where you prefer the new form to the old form, where the use of the new form goes above 50%. That often happens at the same time in different text types. But as a form is falling out of use, it's often retained longer in literary French than it is in journalistic French. And that kind of led me to this idea of, the sort of the archaic value of these forms is somehow more useful for a literary writer than for a journalistic writer. But there was this one really anomalous result where this form, séant, which isn't found after the mid-17th century in literary French, appeared 5 times in 1732. And this was, completely surprising, went against every other, finding that I had. And so it would have looked like an anomaly until you look at the actual periodical itself and the dispatch in which it's used. So all of the forms come from dispatches covering just one event. And this one event is a very exceptional ceremony where the French king holds court from his bed. And this was written up in the press in extraordinary archaic language. It was really very distinct from everything around it. There are whole sets of linguistic choices which make it almost look like it was written 150 years earlier. So I think there we have an example of a dispatch appearing in a periodical, but it isn't reflecting the sort of normal language of the periodical, the kind of typical language of the administrative, commercial, military dispatches. It's more the language of the court, and it's this very archaic legal, administrative language used to talk about the king. And so that example didn't really undermine the general conclusion that the journalistic style, or that these archaisms stay around a little bit longer in literary French. It really just showed that they stay around particularly long in this very highly administrative, legalistic discourse around the king. And so that, I think, otherwise would have just sat there as an outlier. And I'm sure there are other things that, there are many other ways that you can kind of acquire more knowledge and on how to get an even better understanding of data. But I think the transcription really sharpened everything.
Well, I think that's really important implication of the method that you follow here for other people doing digital humanities is the value of the quantitative work is it can point out strangeness or anomalies or transformations, but it's raising a question that other modes of inquiry can actually elucidate, and that means the kind of work that you did, but you could also imagine collaborating with other kinds of historians or different sort of scholars working in those areas. That's great. It's a good time for us to take some questions from the anonymous internet, from people that are following along. And one question struck me because I think it's a great question, not only for linking your first work, which was not just on France, it was on Italy and on this question of translation, because translation is something that's still important for you. And particularly in this book, the question is, could you speculate on what kind of other story or implications you could draw if you are looking at it from another cultural perspective or another cultural context. But it reminds me in the book that you're interested in the way that France became extraterritorial in its linguistic expansion. So maybe that's a good question to say, how did you use some comparative work, or what might you think about doing in the future that would be around this question of translation and cultural diversity in terms of the evolution of languages?
Yeah, there's a lot in that question. If I could just kind of pick a couple of bits of it. I'm looking at the French language press. I'm not looking at the press in France, but the press in French. And so that means also periodicals published outside France. But just because news is published in French doesn't mean it originates in French. And in fact, the Gazette from 1631, for the first kind of 50 or so years of its history, is published in two parts. And one actually is from 1630, the latter part of 1631 onwards. The first part is called Gazette, and the second part is called Nouvelle Ordinaire. And we have a contract, historians have done this work, they found a contract between Renaudot, who published the Gazette, and someone called Jean Epstein, who lived in Paris, but was German. And he agreed to translate the news from German and Dutch newspapers into French. And in fact, that second part of the Gazette de France, for that kind of whole 50 odd years of its publication, we think that almost everything there, if not everything there, is a translation. So I think when, the more I sort of, the more work that I do here, the less I am convinced that I'm working on the French press, right? This is la presse française historique, it's la presse de langue française, but it's also just the European press. If you kind of try to unpick, I have examples of news dispatches from London, which were in the Nouvelle Ordinaire, so in the second part of the Gazette. So we know they must have been translated from German or Dutch into French. So at some point, they must have been translated from English into German or Dutch. So translation in the press, a little bit like today, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, but it's also for the most part invisible, which makes it extremely hard to work on. You have to really rely on these singular events, like Jean Gall has done some work on the fire of Lisbon. And if you look at a single event like that and trace it through the European news, you can start to identify, okay, this newspaper says this says something else, this says something different. You can almost do the kind of work that gets done for manuscripts, where you try to identify a kind of tree, who translated it from whom. And that's where I have actually a lot of hope for digital scholarship in the future, because what was hard until recently, at least now I've been able to be in libraries with images of the different newspapers with me. But until this point, you would really work on a newspaper in one library, then you go to another library and work on another one. And so aligning the text was very hard. And so for the future, I really hope we'll be able to do that kind of detective work to try and trace back to find out what was translated from whom. And I think there we're going to reveal that what we think is translated news is just the tip of the iceberg. I think, a huge amount of it is. So the comparative work, I suppose, is there, and a lot of the work on the genre I compare with the work that's been done on the history of news writing in English. The work that's on translation is kind of implicitly comparative. But I think the next steps for this project, whether I do them or someone else does them, is to look at regional publications. Like the first regional daily newspaper, the Journal de Guyenne, would be an obvious one to look at. And then it's to look at the French press published elsewhere. Something that also came up to me as I was doing this work was newsletters published by Jesuits. So there might be a project there. So I think this is really the sort of first big generalist newspapers published, in Paris and in Amsterdam, real sort of centers of journalism. But this isn't the end. This is just the start. And so there's a real future there, I think. And I'm really hoping that other people join me in that journey, that it isn't just me doing it. That this is,
it's a good question.
I want to hand over.
it's a good question because it allows you to tease out that in fact this French language is circulating in a very new way, precisely because of the new medium. You mentioned Constantinople. Do you find that there's much news from, say, like the American colonies or the French colonies, and who's sending it, or is this something that just, again, is like another part of the project that is new territory for you?
Yeah. So I'm writing a chapter on news translation in the British and Irish press, and I'm collaborating with someone who's this historian, Nicholas Brownlees, who's worked on the English language press. And so something that we're trying to look at, if, until now people have said, yes, there's lots of news about America in the French language press in the second half of the 18th century. I'm trying to use this corpus to get kind of data, right, is to get hard numbers. So how much more is there than there was? So yeah, for absolutely in the second half of the 18th century towards the end of the 18th century, even more. So there's a gradual increase. It doesn't mean that there are more articles necessarily, but there might be longer articles. There's and you definitely see whenever there are, if you look at the history of the press, whenever there's a war that involves France, or that maybe doesn't even involve France, but it's kind of does by implication because it involves Europe. There's an uptick in the publication of news. So news really responds to war. Like war is, war drives news in this period, as it does today, and to some extent as well. And there's a kind of really interesting example of someone called Genet. In the 18th century, so he kind of fell out with his father because he wanted to marry someone of not sufficiently high status, and so he went off to Germany, and he went off to England, and he came back to France having acquired this kind of linguistic competency, and he got hired as a secretary interpreter. And his job was to translate news sheets or newspapers from English into French for the ministries, for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for the administrative powers, and he was translating that, and he or they understood the power of news translation, and so, for example, he was asked to set up, or he suggested setting up a publication of translated news from English during the War of Independence, which would take the side, or which would not take the side of the British. So they hide the fact that this publication, which presents news translated from English as if it were kind of objectively translated and it's published by some private individual. In fact, it's the Crown that's publishing this, and then the selection of items to translate and it is propagandistic, right? It's to take a side. Yeah.
Sounds totally unfamiliar, that whole process.
Oh, right.
So let's switch gears a little. There's a question that I think I'm not sure how it plays out, so I'm interested in your answer. The question is, could you say a little bit more about the dynamics of the relationship between written language and maybe the kinds of written language you're interested in and spoken language? Because you might see the press in different ways, considering that there's a lot of quotation, there's oral speech kind of meets other kinds of language in the text. So just what are your thoughts on that connection between the oral and the written in the historic press?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one that I thought about a bit, both for the contemporary press and for the press in this period. I mean, people do say that the press is oral, and the written press, it isn't, right? It's using letters when we decode them visually. So it is written language. I think when people say it's oral, they mean it has features, at least in the contemporary French press, that remind us of how language normally plays out in oral communication. So you might think of maybe things that are more informal than in literary texts, for example. The kind of, the holy grail for historical linguists is accessing speech from the past. Linguists are inherently more interested in speech than writing. Writing is this kind of secondary form of language to speech. This is something that gets known in linguistics as the bad data problem of historical linguistics. We're we're never going to access speech from the past, so we're constantly trying to make the best of this, of what we have. But if you wanted to look for oral language, it would, I think, not be in the Gazette de France in 1631. This is fundamentally, pretty much, a written genre. Even maybe it represents speech less than literary texts do it at that time. And this is to do with its style. So the way that news discourse is written in this early part of the 17th century, and the way these dispatches don't change themselves very much, it's very impersonal. If there's speech that is referenced, it will not be direct speech at the start. Direct speech is very rare in the historical French press. It's rare in the English press too. It comes in a little bit earlier in the English press as an attempt to kind of make things a bit livelier and more fun. And that happens much later in the French press. So if you were going to look for speech represented on the page, it's probably not in these periodicals, but I think it might be in other types of periodicals. So not these big standard generalist ones. You might find a bit more in one of the periodicals that I looked at, the Mercure Galant, which is a kind of lighter review, but it can also contain a kind of extremely kind of impersonal discourse, as the Gazette de France does. Over the course of the 18th century, or the middle of the 18th century, you do see a change where you get more direct speech, where you get more uses of the first person. But interestingly, that sort of doesn't touch the text type of the news dispatch, which looks pretty similar over the whole course of the century. Things like extracts of letters are published within dispatches. And so the dispatches, these kind of dry texts, continue all the way through to the end of the 18th century, and arguably right through to today with the Bloomberg or Reuters news dispatches today. But in the second half of the 18th century, you do start to kind of hear people speak, but the people you're hearing speak are, the king or William Pitt. Interestingly, speaking in the French press in French, right, just to show where translation is happening. So what you're not hearing or not seeing is any representation of the speech of ordinary people. It's very, very rare to find anything like that in these periodicals, but there may well be others and other types of news and circulation where you would find that.
So we're getting close to the end of our time. I just wonder, maybe we could end with the question of what was the genre of journalistic writing because you've mentioned a lot of now different kinds of writing, from the dry dispatch to the account of the king and so on. Is there a final, not argument, but hypothesis, or at least a preliminary finding about what is the genre of the journalistic texts towards the end of the 18th century in France?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the end of the 18th century, I would have a different answer for the start of the middle of the 17th century. I think at the start, the journalistic genre is quite narrow. We only have dispatches, you get scientific news, you get one periodical, like this lighter Mercure Galant. So I think it's quite sort of narrow at the start. And all three of those in some ways are quite homogenous. By the end of the 18th century, I think you have a journalistic genre that maybe is a little bit more, it's more plural, and in that is more similar perhaps to a modern newspaper, where you would expect a plurality of text types within the one news text. So I think there's, I'm not sure that there is a sort of single way to characterize it. And I think, as I suggested, I would kind of dampen down the importance of periodicity as a kind of characterization, as a qualifying trait. I think periodicity is fundamental. It's incredibly important to a historical linguist, but it isn't the case that you wouldn't have this kind of text were it not for periodicity. So maybe it's all just information which presents itself as true, and whether it is or isn't is a different question.
No, but that's a nice way to end, to say that in fact by the time the journals became established, they were actually offering different kinds of genres and styles and written samples for their readers. So that's an important finding, because you might expect that journalists would write in one way, but in fact you show that there's this really rich diversity of kinds of writing. So we're really at the end here. That was perfect timing. And I just want to thank you again, Mary, for discussing the book, and to the Townsend Center for hosting us. And thanks to all of you who are tuning in on YouTube. It was good to have you, even if we didn't see you.
Thank you very much, David.